My husband introduced me as just a housewife at his company dinner, so I let the entire room discover who saved his business. When my husband called me just a housewife, there were 216 people in the ballroom, and at least half of them heard it. The room laughed politely. That was the worst part. Not the cruelty. The agreement. It was the annual winter dinner for his company glass chandeliers, white tablecloths, tiny desserts arranged like architecture, a string quartet playing songs nobody actually listens to unless there's shrimp involved. I had worn navy silk because Martin liked navy on me. At least he used to. We had been married 23 years, long enough that people assume the shape of your marriage reflects mutual design rather than accumulated compromise. He had one hand at the back of my waist as we moved between tables, introducing me to junior executives and investors, spouses, and one spectacularly bored venture capitalist who kept checking his watch as if human interaction were a tax. "This is my wife, Claire," Martin said. And then, laughing at something one of his directors said, he added, "She keeps me sane. Just a housewife. But honestly, the real CEO at home." Laughter. Soft, approving, unthinking laughter. I smiled. Of course I smiled. Women are handed so many small humiliations in public and expected to hold them like appetizers. Just a housewife. There is a violence in the word just when spoken by someone standing on the scaffolding you built under him. Because here is what no one in that ballroom knew. 5 years earlier, when Martin's company nearly collapsed under a procurement fraud investigation and a liquidity crunch, he still calls that rough quarter. I was the one who found the leak in the vendor chain, rebuilt the internal reporting structure, and wrote the restructuring sequence he later presented to the board as if it had come to him in a weekend of masculine resolve and coffee. I knew because I had worked in operations before our children were born. I knew because numbers tell stories when egos won't. I knew because Martin came into the kitchen one night, white-faced and sweating, dropped a stack of reports on the counter and said, "I think this is worse than I thought. I think..." He was right. It was worse. And I saved him. Not publicly. Not for credit. At first, I did it because I was his wife and because we had 2 children in private school and a mortgage on a house with more windows than wisdom. Then, I kept doing it because he needed me. And somewhere along the line, what I did in private became something he performed in public, as if it were instinct he naturally possessed. He introduced me to 3 more people that night. I heard just a housewife twice more, once in a variation. At dessert, I decided my marriage had entered a phase I could no longer afford. If you've ever smiled in public while privately rewriting the future, comment 1. Some of the most important decisions are made wearing heels and holding a champagne glass. The turning point came in the ladies' room. Not because I cried. I didn't. A woman named Sonia, wife of one of Martin's board members, the wife of barely covered what Sonia was stood beside me at the mirror retouching lipstick with the air of someone who had never rushed for anyone in her life. She caught my eye in the reflection and said, "He shouldn't have said that." I looked at her. "Men rarely realize when they're narrating their own decline," she added. Then she capped the lipstick and left. It was such an elegant sentence I almost wanted to applaud. I went home that night and opened the old files. Yes, I had kept them. Not because I planned revenge. Because I am organized. There's a difference, though one can become the other under pressure. Emails. Draft models. Margin analyses. Vendor consolidation notes. A 12-page memo titled Immediate Stabilization Sequence, with my edits tracked in red. Martin's later presentation to the board with my language stripped of pronouns and converted into confidence. I sat there until 1:40 a.m., rereading the architecture of his survival. Then I checked the current company filings and found something much more useful than insult. Martin was preparing for acquisition talks, quiet ones. Nothing illegal. Not yet. But delicate. Timing sensitive. Reputation dependent. He needed the board aligned, the valuation story clean, and the transition stable. And he had just publicly minimized the one person in his life who knew exactly how unstable his internal operation still was. That wasn't merely unkind. It was unwise. The next morning, I did not confront him. Confrontation is often the least efficient form of truth. Instead, I asked, "How was the investor table after I left?" He looked relieved by my neutrality. "Good. Productive." "And Sonia?" He shrugged. "Sharp woman." "Yes," I said. Then I poured his coffee, kissed his cheek, and watched him leave for an office built partly from my invisible labor. By noon, I had updated my resume. By 3, I had accepted a lunch invitation from Sonia. We met 2 days later at a quiet French restaurant where the butter arrives as if butter has ancestry. She wasted no time. "You don't meet me as a social courtesy," she said. "So why are we here?" "I want a position." "In my husband's company?" "No." That made her smile. "In yours," I said. Sonia owned a logistics consultancy through a holding structure no one seemed to mention, because men are very comfortable consuming women's competence as long as it arrives without branding. She leaned back. "What kind of position?" "One where being underestimated is billable." That got a real laugh. I told her the truth, not all of it, but enough. My operations background, my years out of formal work, my unofficial role in Martin's recovery, my children now grown, my marriage, altered. "Can you prove the work?" she asked. Yes. Would you?" I looked at her for a long second. "Yes," I said again. What followed was not scandal. I want to be clear about that. I did not storm into a boardroom with binders and righteousness. That would have been theatrical and satisfying and strategically stupid. Instead, Sonia hired me as an operations advisor under strict confidentiality. Legitimate role. Clean contract. Serious compensation. Within 6 weeks, I was reviewing supply chain inefficiencies for one of her clients. Within 10, I was running a turnaround sequence that saved them 7 figures in waste exposure. Within 14, I had more professional respect from strangers than I had received in my own dining room in years. Martin noticed the change before he understood it. "You seem busy lately," he said one night. "I am." "With what?" "And work." He laughed. That annoyed me more than the original insult, because dismissal is often reflexive before it becomes fearful. "Doing what?" he asked. I cut my salmon and said, "The kind people pay well for." He stared. "Our biz." "I-day-s." "Are you serious?" I looked up. "You introduced me as just a housewife in a room full of executives. I assumed you preferred not to be consulted." That was the first honest silence we'd had in months. If you know that tone people get when they realize the person they depended on has quietly become independent, comment 1. It's one of the most educational sounds in the world. 3 months later, acquisition talks hit turbulence. An internal systems issue surfaced minor on paper, dangerous in due diligence. Vendor reporting inconsistency. Again, Martin came home late, loosened tie, agitated eyes. I was in the study, reviewing a process map for a freight client. He stood in the doorway. "Can I ask you something?" "You just did." He ignored that. Hypothetically. "Of course." He came in, sat down, looked at the diagrams on my desk, then away from them. "We've got some reconciliation problems before diligence," he said. Nothing dramatic, but the sequencing's off, and there's a backlog in controls. I said nothing. He finally looked at me. "I need your opinion." That sentence should have pleased me. It did not, because respect requested under pressure is not the same as respect given freely. "What happened to just a housewife?" I asked. He flinched. "Good. I didn't mean it like that." "How did you mean it?" "It was a joke." "No," I said quietly. It was a category. He sat very still. Then, because life enjoys symmetry, I did exactly what he had done to me for years. I decided whether his usefulness outweighed my hurt. I helped him, but this time with conditions. Written consulting agreement. Compensation. Attribution in strategy summaries. No informal labor. No social erasure. No borrowed genius disguised as marital support. He signed. He had to. I stabilized the sequence in 9 days. The acquisition proceeded. 6 weeks later, at the final celebratory dinner, smaller this time, more serious room, no string quartet, Martin stood to thank the team. He thanked the CFO, the legal group, the transaction advisors. Then he stopped, looked at me, and said, "There is one person in this room whose contribution to this company I have underestimated for far too long. My wife, Claire, has advised this business at critical moments, including this one, and anything I've built in the last 5 years has stood, in part, on work she should have been credited for much earlier." No one laughed. That's how I knew it mattered. Was it enough? No. Public correction does not erase private diminishment, but it was true. And truth, even when late, can still rearrange a room. We divorced 18 months later. Not explosively, not even bitterly, by the end. Just honestly. We had built too much of our marriage on my accommodation and his appetite for being reflected well. He is not a villain, which is perhaps the least satisfying part of the story, but often the most accurate. He was simply a man who grew used to standing in light, partially generated by someone else, and forgot to turn around. Sonia still sends me impossible clients, and I still enjoy rescuing businesses run by men who think soft skills are what women do while the real work happens elsewhere. My daughter once asked if I regretted not making a bigger scene that first night. I told her no. A scene would have embarrassed him. What I wanted was education, and that takes longer. Sometimes I still think about the ballroom, the chandeliers, the shrimp, the little burst of laughter after Just a Housewife. If I'm being generous, I think, none of them knew. If I'm being honest, I think, that was the problem. Because invisibility is not the absence of contribution. It is often the condition under which contribution is extracted. Not anymore.